All right, you guys, as you can see by the thumbnail, I'm back with another one like the other one. So this story right here was somewhat of a high profile story when it first broke. So I'm sure there's already some of you that are probably already familiar with it and what it entails. At any rate, this story is about a Whittier police officer, Keith Boyer, who was allegedly shot and killed by a self-proclaimed gang member, Christopher Mejia, who also went by the moniker Stomper. So aside from Officer Boyer being shot and murked, Stomper is also charged with allegedly shooting a second police officer named Patrick Hazel. Hazel was shot once in the stomach but survived. The third victim, who also died as a result of his injuries, was an individual by the name of Roy Torres. And Torres was also a known gang member who went by the moniker Spaz. And Spaz was supposed to be Stomper's blood cousin. So once again, here's another story that has all the parallels and similarities when it comes to the main character that this story is based on, Stomper. So Stomper, who grew up in Norwalk, got affiliated with gangs and started experimenting with drugs at around the age of 12. He also comes from a broken family and has a younger brother who goes by the moniker Boy. And like most kids that come from broken families, Stomper and Boy both took to the streets and found the family dynamic through their street gang. Their street gang became their family. You guys know that I've ran dozens and dozens of stories about gang members. And in doing so, I went through some of the intricate details insofar as their personal profiles. This included when they got involved with gangs, when they started experimenting with drugs, the family dynamics of whether or not they came from a broken family, etc., etc. What I'm basically saying is that when I've done some of these profiles and I've talked about some of the details regarding their backgrounds and their personal histories, I've often alluded to the age of when they started getting involved with gangs, drugs, alcohol, and some of these other vices. And it just seems like the age of 12 is the common age that a lot of young kids end up getting wrapped up in the streets. Gangs, drugs, drinking alcohol, and those kinds of things. I just talked about this and elaborated on it in one of the recent stories that I just put out. In fact, some of you might remember seeing it. It was a story called Cold-Blooded Paranoia, where Selvin Salazar, a gang member from Inglewood, shot his girl's two best friends, his best friend, his girl, who at that time was pregnant, carrying his unborn child. The common denominator between that story and this one is that both of these guys were twacked out on Chris when they committed these crimes. I'm not going to repeat all the things I said in this other story about the detrimental effects of it, or how multiple days of not sleeping can cause you to hallucinate, chronic paranoia, or can ultimately lead to you committing a serious crime like this while slipping into a deep state of psychosis, where you've basically lost touch with all sense of reality and you're no longer in control of your physical abilities. So anyways, this story starts out on February 20th, 2017 on the east side of Los Angeles. Early that morning at a house located on the 1400 block of Voney Drive, Spaz, Stomper's cousin, was waiting for Stomper to come by his house. They had made plans to meet up that night or early the next morning, which would have been on February 20th, 2017. So Spaz had been living at this house for the past 2 years with his father, but the reasons why he was staying there were twofold. For one, Spaz was struggling. He was going through a hard time in his life financially, and his father wanted to help him. Rather for him to be homeless or be out running the streets, Spaz's father allowed him to convert the garage into a small makeshift apartment and stay there with him. The other purpose was for Spaz to act as an in-home caretaker and to care for his ailing father, a father who had been constrained with a number of serious medical issues. So with the assistance of a few friends, Spaz converted the garage into a fully sustainable living area that was equipped with a kitchen, a bathroom, and a small bedroom. And even though Spaz had his father and other family that were supporting him and trying to help him transition away from drugs and the criminal element that he always surrounded himself with, Spaz kept taking steps backwards and he couldn't break that cycle. So Stomper, who was from a gang called Winter Gardens, was somebody that Spaz had always looked up to. Obviously, being cousins, they had known each other all their lives. But the last time that Stomper had went to prison, he got the letters WG for Winter Gardens blasted across his face. And this just made it more obvious to Spaz that Stomper was a true believer in his gang. And this was something that Spaz admired about Stomper. So again, I don't know what the specific purpose was for Stomper going by Spaz's house that night, but people that were closely associated with both of these guys seemed to think that it had something to do with drugs. That maybe Stomper went by to see if he could borrow some money, or that maybe Spaz had the bag himself. But either way, during the entire week that this incident happened on, or the days leading up to it, Stomper apparently started using meth again. And from everything that I heard, he was on a good one. By the time he went by Spaz's house that night, he had already been up for about 5 days and he was already crashing out. And again, this is something else that I talked about in one of my recent stories. I believe it was the same story. But when you haven't slept for that many days, 4 or 5 days at a time, and you're still ingesting that stuff, you reach a point where you start hallucinating, you black out. And this is when you slip into a state of psychosis, where you no longer know what you're doing. At any rate, whatever happened that night in Spaz's garage, something led to a physical altercation where Stomper and Spaz apparently got into it about something. And this ultimately led to Stomper pulling out a 9mm Glock and shooting Spaz. Again, this is all speculation, but because it was given to me when I was looking into the facts of this case, I'm just going to give it to you guys anyway. So for whatever reason, people that were closely associated with these two seem to think that this had something to do with Stomper either trying to borrow some money or take some money from Spaz so that he could buy more drugs. Because again, Stomper was on a good 5 or 6 day run at that point, and he'd already started to crash out. And for those of you that don't know what the term crashing out means, it's basically a reference to when you peak out or you reach the highest point you can when you're on a run like this, and then you crash out or you flatline. This could mean that you either fall out and go to sleep for 4 or 5 days straight. I've seen it happen. Or you just blank out and go into this state of psychosis that I mentioned where you don't remember nothing. Either way, you lose touch with reality and you become delusional, all from the lack of sleep and from just being on a good one. So Stomper, he shoots Spaz in the garage and then possibly takes whatever money or drugs he has. And then he steals the keys to his car, a gray Dodge Stratus. So when the shooting occurred, Stomper and Spaz were the only two in the garage. But Spaz's father and the next door neighbor heard the gunshots as soon as it happened. So somebody ended up calling 911 and reporting that they heard gunshots because the paramedics and first responders arrived within minutes. In that area right there where this happened at, they have a sheriff's and a fire department training center right off of Northeastern Avenue that's just a few blocks away. So they got there fast. And although they arrived literally within minutes of the shooting and performed whatever life-saving measures that they could, Spaz was still pronounced deceased on the scene as his injuries ended up being fatal. So before I go into the details of what happened next, let me just say this. This story right here about Stomper ended up turning into a political firefight, or better yet, a political rallying cry. A political rallying cry by criminal justice experts that were appointed to examine this case and identify local law enforcement's failures. On that same note, the finger pointing seemed to have been blaming everyone, including the LA District Attorney's Office, who apparently missed a chance to send Stomper to jail a few weeks before the shootings. I'll come back to that in a minute, but aside from some of the debates that this case caused, others were blaming changes in California laws, such as Assembly Bill 109, known as the Realignment Act, that contributed to some of the underlying circumstances in this case, as well as Proposition 47 that was also passed in 2014. And this was a voter-approved initiative that reduced several felonies to misdemeanors, as well as other felonies that were previously classified as wobblers. So these were just two changes in California law that were blamed for putting Stomper in a position to commit these crimes, and this case kicked off a huge debate. So these were some of the specific findings that became focal points in the examination of his case and how the California justice system dropped the ball when they ran him through their own system. And this case was also used to show lawmakers how California's policy of allowing probation officers to supervise state parolees is a complete failure and is part of the reason why individuals like Stomper aren't being held accountable for breaking parole guidelines. They were basically saying that probation officers were ill-equipped, undertrained, and that they were being overwhelmed with massive caseloads of parolees. And as a result, there's no more accountability, supervision is inadequate, and parole has become a free-for-all. Or better yet, a rubber stamp for parolees to do whatever they want, when they want. So the probation officer that Stomper was assigned to drew a lot of criticism for an excessive amount of short jail stints. That's also known as flash violations. And a flash violation is basically a quick turnaround, something that could be as short as a week. So the criminal justice experts that did this examination, they claim that because Stomper had an addiction to drugs, that he should have been referred to a mandatory substance abuse treatment program as soon as he was released from prison. And when the probation department finally did step up and decide to get tough, a probation officer recommended that Stomper spend 3 months in jail, followed by a court-ordered residential drug treatment program. They wanted to put him in drug treatment, which would have meant that he wouldn't have been on the streets. But in this case, it was the prosecutor that dropped the ball because the prosecutor didn't include the probation officer in the plea agreement. So the prosecutor was never made aware of the extent of Stomper's escalating drug and gang activity. So the county waited until Stomper finally admitted to using black and asking for help. But even then, they drug their feet and waited another 2 weeks. And by that time, he didn't show up. So at this point, fearing that his probation officer was getting ready to violate him and put him back in custody, Stomper called his probation officer and told him that he had a construction job lined up working with his father and that he promised that he would get on methadone treatment by the end of the week. But this ended up being bullshit, and he made these promises for the sole purpose of placating his probation officer and for leading him to believe that he was finally getting back on the right track. So with all that being said, I guess what they're now claiming is that Stomper never would have been in a position to commit these crimes if probation, parole, the district attorney, and the local courts had done their jobs instead of allowing this cycle to repeat itself. So Stomper had just recently paroled from Pelican Bay State Prison prior to this incident happening. And like all parolees that were paroling at that time, he was well aware of the fact that he could do whatever he wanted once he got back out, because everyone knew that there was almost no accountability if you were on parole. Everybody knew that because the prisons were overcrowded at that time, that if they committed a violation, they'd either be sent back on a flash violation or they'd be recommended to an outpatient drug program, which basically meant nothing. You know, I said this before, but I'll make this point again. I had two numbers and I had two 4-year tails. And I practically did almost 7 years just in parole violations alone, because parole was a lot different back in the 1990s. I used to get hit for 10, 11, or 12-month flat violations for anything I did wrong. So these guys had it easy. In fact, because of some of the changes in California law, Stomper was actually released early on parole. He was released early because the prisons were overcrowded. This was all part of the Realignment Act. So anyways, after Stomper shoots Spaz, he steals his car. He takes off in his gray Dodge Stratus in a high rate of speed, and he's literally all over the place. You know, I'm sure if Stomper wasn't crashing out, he would have been more conscious of his driving. His priority would have been to get away and would have been to avoid law enforcement. But by this point, he was in no condition to be driving, and if he was trying to fly under the radar, he was failing bad. His driving was so reckless that he was blowing through stop signs, driving up on the sidewalk. He was blowing through red lights, causing fender benders on every street he was driving on. But again, his mind wasn't thinking about getting away. He was in a fog, and his paranoia only made him drive faster. So as Stomper turned on Colima Road and began to approach Mar Vista, he blew through a stoplight and T-boned a blue Honda Civic that was traveling westbound through a green light. So the Civic did 2 full 360-degree spins before it slammed into a white Mercedes-Benz. And despite the fact that Stomper crashed while driving at a high rate of speed, somehow he got lucky and wasn't injured. And trip on this, even in the midst of the confusion and after crashing in this drug stupor he was in, he still had the sense of mind to know that he had to hurry up because the cops were going to be there any minute. So the driver of the Honda Civic wasn't hurt either, and Stomper somehow convinced this guy to help give him a push. Imagine that, after barreling into this guy, he asked him to give him a push, and the guy does it. That's comedy. So Stomper knew that if he could push the Dodge that he was driving just a little bit down the street, that the cops might not see it, or they might not know that he was involved in the accident. At least that's what he was thinking. But that just goes to show you how irrational his thinking really was. Because although the cops might not have made that initial connection, they were definitely going to find out as soon as they started talking to some of the other accident victims. They were definitely going to say something. So the 911 dispatcher originally put a call out to officers Keith Boyer and Thomas Osendorf, who were both on patrol in that area, advising them that there was a 3-vehicle accident on Colima Road in Mar Vista. So these two officers, they respond to the scene of the accident in separate vehicles. And then as soon as the call was announced on the radio, a third officer, Patrick Hazel, asked to be assigned to the call as well. So you had 3 different officers that were responding to this scene. And although Officer Boyer and Officer Osendorf weren't really considered to be traffic cops, they had still responded to hundreds of these calls before in the past. And responding to traffic accidents was always an unpredictable event. You never knew what you were going to encounter. So Officer Osendorf was the first officer to arrive on the scene. Hazel arrived second, and then Boyer was the last one to get there. You know, in the most extreme scenarios like this, you'd pull up and you find somebody deceased or they'd be in a vehicle that was burning. You know, the one thing that you didn't normally have to worry about when pulling up to a traffic accident was pulling up to a crowd that was all pissed off or mad at you like you would in a domestic dispute or somebody that had just been assaulted or some other type of serious call. Those calls were always considered to be dangerous as people's emotions were always running high and they'd usually always be worked up. So I say this because Officer Boyer and Officer Osendorf were treating this like any other routine traffic accident. They weren't really expecting too much to happen. They were going to run their plates, pull their insurance, find out who was at fault, etc., etc. And this call came in as a non-injury or a light injury accident. So there was no real pressing need to get there fast. Everything was kind of methodic and they were just doing their jobs. So when they finally pulled up to Kalima Road, the first thing they seen was the blue Honda Civic sitting in the middle of the street. It was sitting in the same spot that it had been since it got into the accident. The Benz was also in the same spot, sitting next to the Honda, parallel but facing in the opposite direction. You know, sometimes you pull up and it'd be nothing but a fender bender and everybody would be standing around waiting to be interviewed. And at other times you'd have to pull up and render assistance to several people that were in a bad accident. Officer Boyer started with the Civic and then Officer Hazel began questioning the driver to the Benz. So after Officer Boyer finished talking to the driver in the Civic, he was then advised that there was a third vehicle that was a little ways down the street that was also involved in the accident. And that vehicle was described as a gray Dodge Stratus. So after getting a visual on the gray Dodge Stratus, Officer Boyer started making his way towards the vehicle. And as he made his way towards the vehicle, he noted that the driver, a male with a bald head wearing a blue LA Dodger sweatshirt, was still sitting in the vehicle. So as Officer Boyer made his way to the driver's side door, he started talking to Stomper. Meanwhile, Officer Hazel walked up and began running Stomper's plates. So at that point, Boyer moved to the passenger side of the vehicle to retrieve a fingerprint scanner. And as soon as he moved to the passenger side of the vehicle, dispatch advised the two officers that the plates came back stolen. So in light of this information, both officers approached Stomper and asked him to get out of the car. Initially, Stomper protested. He wanted to know why he was being asked to get out of the car. And then almost instantly, he shifted gears. And I'm not talking about shifting gears on the car. I'm talking about shifting gears in his mind. So then he gets out of the car. So after he gets out of the car, he turns his back to him, almost like he was assuming position to get handcuffed. So at that point, Officer Boyer was standing directly behind him, and Officer Hazel was standing towards the back of the vehicle on Stomper's right side. And then without warning, Stomper pulled a Glock 9mm semi-automatic handgun from his waistband and shot Officer Hazel several times, hitting him in the stomach, and then one of his bullets struck his holstered firearm. Either Stomper was a good shot or this was just some lucky shooting, because when he hit the officer's gun, the gun ended up being damaged so bad that it was almost inoperable. So Stomper then spun around and shot Officer Boyer before he could draw his gun. So Officer Boyer was fatally hit 3 times in the chest, fell to the ground, and almost died immediately. Hazel, on the other hand, after being shot, was able to move himself to the front of the vehicle and take cover. And this ended up putting him in a position in front of the Dodge Stratus where he would have had a clear shot at Stomper. But Stomper had luck on his side that day, because even though Officer Hazel was able to get off one shot, it missed Stomper and he wasn't able to fire his gun again. The gun was too badly damaged. It had been so badly damaged while it was in his holster that he put the gun down and radioed for help. So there was still a third officer, Officer Osendorf, who apparently started running towards the direction of the gunshots. Apparently, as he got closer, he seen Officer Boyer laying on the ground, motionless. Then he spotted Stomper, who was still armed. You know, being that this officer had the drop on Stomper, he should have been able to get him. But I don't know if it was nerves or he just wasn't a good shot. I don't know what it was. But he ended up firing 14 shots at Stomper, and out of those 14 shots, he only hit him once. Again, luck must have been on Stomper's side that day. And as soon as Stomper was hit, he yelled out, "You got me." And then he threw his gun on the ground. And luck really was on Stomper's side that day. And I'm going to tell you why. Because a lot of the times when you shoot a cop like that, especially out there in LA, They don't care if you drop your gun or not. You're going to get shot. They're going to get their runbacks. So anyways, after Stomper throws his gun on the ground, he puts his hands up and then he takes a knee. After he goes down, Officer Osendorf and Officer Hazel move in to handcuff him, and then they make the arrest. So after Stomper was placed in the back of a squad car, it was then determined that Stomper had fired all his bullets. His gun was completely empty. However, the slide was in the forward position, so it was almost impossible to determine whether the gun was loaded without physically inspecting it. So after surmising the incident, it was pretty clear that Officer Boyer and Officer Hazel had both been ambushed. Both of them were caught completely off guard. And again, I'm sure when Officer Boyer first heard the gunshots, he went to draw a service revolver, but Stomper was quicker on the draw. And unfortunately, despite the fact that both of these officers were wearing their standard department-issued Kevlar body armor, the bullets still found their mark and penetrated their vest. And again, part of the reason why these two officers were caught off guard is because, like I said, they were under the assumption that they were responding to a traffic accident, a routine traffic accident, nothing more, nothing less. And understandably, nothing is just routine. I'm sure they were ready to respond to whatever they encountered, to respond with contingencies when unexpected circumstances arose. But when you're responding to a traffic accident and you get ambushed, this puts you at somewhat of a disadvantage. So the Whittier Fire Department, the paramedics, and the first responders all arrived within minutes of the shootings. And although they did what they could to provide life-saving measures, Officer Boyer was pronounced deceased on the spot. On the other hand, Officer Hazel and Stomper were both transported to a local hospital where they were treated for their injuries and survived. So while Stomper was still recovering from his injuries at the hospital, he was interviewed by two homicide detectives, Dean Camarillo and Omar Miranda. And the entire interview lasted somewhere close to 45 minutes. So for the most part, the majority of the interview consisted of a lot of back and forth cat and mouse games, where Stomper tried claiming that he blacked out and couldn't remember what happened. And he attributed this to his chronic drug use. But the detectives, they continued to press him. They continued to press him until he finally admitted to the shootings and furthermore claimed that all three of his victims had it coming. His words verbatim were, "I guess I smoked a cop, I smoked my cousin, I shot another cop. What else do you want me to say?" And when the detectives tried to get a motive as to why he shot his cousin Spaz, the only thing that Stomper would say was that he had that coming. I told him to keep his nose clean and I told him to stay out the way, but he didn't listen. The detectives then tried to determine whether or not he had any ties to the Mexican mafia and whether or not he was linked in with this criminal organization. But Stomper adamantly denied being affiliated with anyone other than his street gang, Winter Gardens. He told the detectives to stop trying to flip this into something bigger than what it was, otherwise he was going to terminate the interview. Bottom line, he said, "Look, I smoked my cousin, I shot a cop, I smoked another one. Nobody told me to do it. I'm not tied into nobody, and this isn't about anybody else but me. When I get locked up, that's another thing. I follow the program and I do what I gotta do because I know what time it is. But that's all there is to it." I don't know if this was his plan all along or if Stomper just decided to concoct a way to make himself appear to be some type of martyr that was taking one for the team. But that's the sense that I got after listening to his interview. Because Stomper then goes into this long dissertation about AB 109 and how the state of California dropped the ball by spending money on inmates instead of on kids who have been afflicted with cancer. He then claims that this is the reason why he shot his victims, that this was all some type of informal, sacrificial Christianing, and that he was fulfilling a cause. He said, "I did it for my barrio, for my people." And then he takes one last shot at law enforcement, not just the cops that were there at the scene, but just cops in general. He says, "I delayed it. I should have smoked them quicker. They didn't come out with both of their guns pointed at me like they should have. Because if they would have come out with both guns pointed, then it would have been a whole different ballgame." The detectives then posed a question to Stomper that makes me think that they were just trying to stir the pot. Because then they ask him, "Is there anything you want to say to the Whittier Police Department?" Now, in light of the circumstances, why would they pose a question like that? I guess one might say that they were hoping he would make an incriminating statement like he did, or like I said, if they were just trying to stir the pot. Stomper, of course, falls right into their little trap. He says, "You got to start training your guys better." I mean, they just got a taste of a real LA gang member, an active, real LA gang member. You know what I mean? And nope, I don't feel sorry. Because I know that if they would have dropped me, they wouldn't have been feeling sorry for my family. So the rest of the interview is just Stomper and the detectives doing a bunch of lead up to the statements that I already highlighted. But other than that, there's nothing else really worthy of pointing out. At any rate, sometime after August 27th of 2021, Stomper's case went to trial in the Norwalk Superior Court courtroom. The prosecutor, Deputy District Attorney Garrett Dameron, brought in several gang experts to come in and provide testimony as to Stomper's possible motives, about his motives, and about how shooting cops could actually increase his standings within the gang element. So Detective David Duran from the Los Angeles Sheriff's Department came in and testified that murking a cop and attempting to murk a second cop is the type of crime that would definitely increase Stomper's standings in his street gang, Winter Gardens. Duran also testified that a crime like this could actually also increase Stomper's stock as a solid gang member to potentially be recruited into a prison gang such as the Mexican Mafia as well. Furthermore, he also pointed out that since Stomper committed this crime, that his street gang has also used this case to increase its own standing amongst other gangs in that area, and that this was based on graffiti that they had seen in Winter Gardens' established territory. The graffiti that they had seen was WG 13-187 on a cop. Duran claimed that this type of graffiti started surfacing almost immediately after Stomper shot Officer Boyer and Officer Hazel. You know, the other thing that was noteworthy about Stomper's trial is some of the antics that he himself had demonstrated throughout his trial. Making faces, sticking his tongue out at some of the victims' families during impact statements, and just his overall demeanor. He maintained an air of arrogance throughout the entire trial. You know, during critical points of testimony that was given by different people that testified at his trial, he also laughed and made a mockery out of some of the victims as they were being talked about. He also wore a coronavirus LA Dodgers face mask to represent himself as an active gang member. And it was also obvious that he was basking in this attention as he was playing to the cameras. And surprisingly, his lawyer, his defense attorney, Paul Cohen, participated in wearing a blue face mask himself. The prosecutor believed that this was a tactic that Stomper purposely instituted to conceal his face tattoos from the jury. The DA, Garrett Dameron, theorized that even though they had pictures to show Stomper's face tattoos to the jury, that it would have had a much more dramatic effect seeing it in person themselves. The prosecutor actually tried to get the judge, Roger Ito, to issue a court order to remove the face mask. But by then, Judge Ito agreed that if you would have ordered him to take off his face mask, it might have had a prejudicial effect on the jury, and that definitely would have been an appellate issue. So initially, this was being pursued as a death penalty case. In 2018, prosecutors formally announced that they were seeking capital punishment against Stomper. And despite having all the required elements that included pleas from the victims' families, politics overshadowed this part of the case as well. 2 months after District Attorney George Gascon was sworn into office, Gascon issued a statement indicating that due to a mandate from the public where he vowed that he would no longer seek death penalty cases, it was being formally taken off the table. And this right here, it created a lot of backlash amongst the public and some of the victims' families, who obviously felt like this case right here was custom made for capital punishment. But the prosecuting attorney, Garrett Dameron, said that his hands were tied and there was nothing he could do about it. So in the end, on February 20th, 2017, Stomper was convicted on 2 counts of first-degree homicide, attempted homicide, carjacking, ex-felon in possession of a weapon, and a litany of other charges. And the same judge that heard the trial evidence, Judge Roger Ito, imposed 2 life sentences in California State Prison without the possibility of parole, citing that Stomper deserved the same type of savage and violent fate that he administered to his victims. Ito said that, unfortunately, he was mandated to follow the sentencing guidelines that were already set in this case, despite the strong, uninhibited feeling that justice was not served adequately in this case. So there you have it, another young, self-proclaimed gang member sentenced to life in prison for either one of 2 things: for either falling victim to his own ill-fated drug addiction and crashing out after being on a good one, or, as he would rather have you believe, for remaining resolute to a belief system that he's obviously still inspired by, one where he felt strong enough about that he was willing to sacrifice the rest of his days on this earth for. You know, I personally don't think that he gets it. Maybe he's still coming down off that good one he was on. Or maybe he's just never experienced what else there is out there to enjoy in life. Life beyond that little dark corner of the world that a lot of us choose to stay stranded in. It's kind of sad when you think about it, but any man who feels that he's serving a righteous cause or purpose for spending the rest of his life in prison, deprived of women and all the luxuries that this world has to offer out here, definitely has his priorities mixed up. I guess for those of us that are lucky, that light turns on sooner or later. And then for the others, the ones that just don't get it, I guess that light never turns on. And then if it does, they still can't make themselves see it. Anyways, I hope you guys have enjoyed this episode of Paradigm Profiles. If you guys liked this episode, give it a thumbs up. If you didn't like this episode, give it a thumbs down. But either way, drop a comment and let me know what you think. As always, I just want to thank those of you who continue to show your unwavering support and also for just continuing to tap into the channel. Until the next one, you guys keep pushing that positivity and enjoy the rest of your day. With that being said, this is your boy B, and I'm gone.